Perfect. So first of all, thank you very much for this excellent conference. I've very much enjoyed all the papers, especially two fascinating papers on a similar topic to mine yesterday on Antiquities Law. So the focus of this paper is the first 3 decades of 20th century political control of Cypriot archaeology. And I think during this period, political control of archaeology was shared uneasily between classically educated British officials and Greek Cypriot politicians, many of whom viewed their engagement with Cyprus's ancient history as an expression of their pan-Hellenic politics. This is an intriguing period, which is examined by an increasing body of work, most notably excellent studies by Despina Pallaides, R.S. Moriles, and most recently Thomas Kiley, and 2 interesting papers yesterday as well by Paulina Nicolaou and Stella Diacu, which added further to my understanding. Hopefully this paper is going to set out, on the basis of unstudied documents from the UK National Archives, the need for further exploration of the role of Cypriots in shaping archaeological policy in the colonial period, and in particular of the links between the movement for a gnosis, political union between Greece and Cyprus, and archaeology, with particular reference to the Cyprus Legislative Council's debates about the 1905 Antiquities Law. Secondly, this paper will also reconsider Michael Given's influential and very interesting 1998 paper, Inventing the Etio-Cypriots, Imperialist Archaeology and the Manipulation of Ethnic Identity, which argued that the British authorities in Cyprus politically manipulated Cypriot archaeology in the 1930s. And I'll argue specifically that while the colonial authorities were highly aware of archaeology's political importance, their engagement with archaeology was both more complicated but also rather less sophisticated than Given suggested in his original paper. Despina Pallaides' deeply interesting George Jeffreys, His Diaries in the Ancient Monuments of Cyprus, illustrates the key role of the Cyprus Museum Committee, composed primarily of Greek Cypriot subscribers, in shaping archaeological policy during this period. In his role as Inspector of Ancient Monuments, Jeffrey believed that the committee ran the museum as a pan-Hellenic political enterprise. Commissioned to design a new building for the museum in 1906, Jeffrey used plans from the Greek National Archaeological Museum at Athens and commissioned, quote, an exact copy of the same size made of the Athena Nike temple, which you should be able to see here, to serve as an entrance for, quote, the purpose of pleasing the natives. He rather condescendingly suggested that the Greek Cypriots wished for the Cyprus Museum to be, quote, a sort of nationalist memorial to our Homeric ancestors, noting that while natives of the Christian kind, quote, began to take an immense interest, the Turks took no notice of it. To Jeffrey, the Turkish Cypriot Cadi, an ex officio member of the museum committee, seemed, quote, absurdly out of place. In Towards a Fuller History of the Cyprus Museum in 2005, R.S. Moriles discussed a group of reports and letters from the British School at Athens archive, in which Jerome Farrell of the British School noted that the museum committee were, quote, on political grounds intolerant of English interference. Archaeology in Cyprus is governed on all sides by political difficulties. As discussed yesterday, by the 1890s, the scale of antiquities exports had become extremely controversial. On 24 July 1901, High Commissioner of Cyprus, Sir William Haynes Smith, wrote to Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain that the island's antiquities legislation required strengthening, noting that, quote, the elected members of the Legislative Council are willing, indeed anxious, to raise the funds that may be necessary, but they desire to annex the condition that no antiquities shall in future be exported from Cyprus. In July 1903, Haynes Smith's administration introduced a new antiquities law in the Legislative Council. On 7 July, Greek Cypriot elected council member Christodoulos Sozos proposed an amendment stating that, quote, all antiquities and ancient monuments in Cyprus are the inalienable property of the people of Cyprus. Sozos argued that only duplicates should be exported. Mayor of Limassol, Sozos was a leading early proponent of a gnosis who succeeded in passing a motion calling for a gnosis in the Legislative Council in 1903. He volunteered to fight for Greece as a private in the First Balkan War of 1912 and died fighting in Epirus shortly afterwards. and on the screen there is a memorial to Sozos in Limassol Park. The High Commissioner replied to Sozos in the Legislative Council that he sympathised with Sozos's motives, but he thought it expedient to allow the export of duplicates on the grounds that all excavations by foreign capital ought not be prevented. Also, that too hard and fast a line led to the evasion of the law with regard to articles that were at all movable. In response, Sozos argued that strict laws in Greece had not deterred foreign excavation and declared, "The word shame was a severe term, but it was one which the government well deserved. For many years, the country had clamoured against the despoliation of its antiquities, and now the government came forward and wished to claim the lion's share of them. The elected members did not understand how the scientific world would be more enlightened if the antiquities left the island and were placed in the British Museum. The example of what happened in Ngomi was too recent to be forgotten. The 2/3 of those finds found their way to the British Museum, and the only gain to Cyprus had been the sum of 5 pence, which had been paid to the owner of the land." The bill was withdrawn pending further discussion. In March of the following year, Sozos sought to pressure the government by posing a series of pointed questions about excavations on the island and the proportion of finds exported. In April 1905, the British authorities partially relented and amended the bill to prohibit the export of antiquities without special permission from the High Commissioner. An acrimonious 6-day debate nonetheless ensued as the three Turkish Cypriot council members expressed concern that the bill granted the Cyprus Museum Committee over historic mosques and religious buildings owned by the Muslim religious authorities. They argued that this breached Sharia law and implied the committee was essentially a Greek Cypriot organization. Some of the mosques in question would have been converted churches carrying obvious sensitivities. It was eventually agreed to exempt Muslim religious buildings from the control of the Museum Committee, but disagreement then arose about the committee's composition. Turkish Cypriot member of the Legislative Council, Cevket Bey, unsuccessfully argued that 2 members of the Legislative Council, one Greek Cypriot and one Turkish Cypriot, should be statutorily appointed to the Museum Committee. As no Turkish Cypriot was ever elected to the Museum Committee, it is likely that Cevket Bey was trying to increase Turkish Cypriot representation. In some cases, theoretical expressions of moral outrage at antiquities exports may have coexisted with deep complicity in the collection and export of looted antiquities. A January 1912 Government of Cyprus minute paper noted that the theoretical restrictions on the export of antiquities passed in 1905 remained almost entirely unenforced. Smugglers could only be detected by searching every person going on the ships. Penalties were farcical and no deterrent, and the Cyprus Museum's register of fines was populated with useless entries such as 1 vase. Governor Sir Ronald Storrs wrote he had been told, quote, "I would be astonished if I heard the names of the smugglers." Storrs' private secretary, who also served as Inspector of Antiquities, Rupert Gunnis, replied suggesting that Legislative Council member Luke Periides was a leading smuggler. Ironically, Gunnis himself was deeply involved in the illegal export of antiquities. As such, it's tempting to speculate that Storrs' original comment was aimed at Gunnis, and potentially Gunnis' accusation against Periides was a skillful diversion. A long-term member of the Museum Committee and Legislative Council, Periides also served as Swedish and German consul. Most famously, he initiated the Swedish Cypress expedition after a chance meeting with Professor Axel Persson on a train in Serbia. Attorney General Demetrius suggested that, quote, "Luke Periides, as a member of the Museum Committee, is enabled to purchase antiquities, apparently for the museum, but in reality for his own collection." The evidence for this claim appears to have been a trial in May 1929. On 25 May, Georgios Nicolaou, Mukhtar of Tremafusha near Larnaca, was sentenced to a month's imprisonment for possession of unregistered antiquities. The Mukhtar claimed that Periides, as a member of the Legislative Committee, had asked him to store the antiquities. The Chief of Police deemed there was insufficient evidence to search Periides' house. Possibly the political cost of investigating was considered to be intolerable. Michael Given's article, Inventing the Etio-Cypriots, Imperialist Archaeology and the Manipulation of Ethnic Identity, argued that the Greek colonial rulers of Cyprus exploited ancient history and archaeology to combat Greek nationalism. Specifically, Gibbons suggested that Einar Gerstad, leader of the Swedish Cyprus expedition, colluded with Ronald Storrs to construct a non-Greek ethnic group at Amathus near Limassol called the Etio-Cypriots by cynically interpreting a small group of untranslatable Cypro-syllabic inscriptions as a non-Greek language. For Gibbon, this forgery was, quote, intended to deny the Hellenic character of ancient and modern Cyprus in response to the political crisis caused by the burning of Government House by Greek irredentists on 21 October 1931. Although the early 20th century equation of an unknown language with an unknown ethnic group is now regarded with deep skepticism, Gibbon's argument that the Etio-Cypriots were fabricated has largely been rejected by linguists and epigraphers. Most recently, Philippa Steele identified at least 26 legible but untranslatable inscriptions from Amathus, Pathos, and Kurion, which possess shared, positively identifiable linguistic characteristics. Steele and Marcus Egertmeyer separate this corpus from a second group of untranslatable inscriptions at Golgoi, which they believe to be linguistically distinct. However, scholars have nonetheless widely accepted that the Etio-Cypriots were employed by British propagandists to deny Cyprus's Hellenicity. Responses to Gibbon's article by Peter van Dommelen, Yanis Hamilakis, and Paul St. Cassia accepted that the Etio-Cypriots were, quote, consciously manipulated for political ends. Both Thierry Petit and Philippa Steele conceded that the Etio-Cypriots were called upon by British imperialist propaganda. However, no official or semi-official publication from the 1930s or 1940s referred to the Etio-Cypriots. Rupert Gunnis's 1936 guidebook, Historic Cyprus, referred to Amathus as a Phoenician stronghold and did not mention the Etio-Cypriots or an autarkic indigenous population. A 1932 exchange of letters between Governor Sir Ronald Storrs and Professor Arnold Toynbee offers a more nuanced view of the British authorities' approach to the politics of Cypriot archaeology. In February 1932, Professor Toynbee dispatched drafts of an article on the autumn 1931 Greek nationalist demonstrations in Cyprus to Storrs in Nicosia and the Colonial Office in London. Toynbee's previous record on Greek nationalism was complex and worth briefly examining. Toynbee first taught classics at Balliol College in Oxford before founding the UK Foreign Office's research analyst and becoming the inaugural Corias Professor of Modern Greek and Byzantine Studies at King's College London. His chair was explicitly endowed to support Anglo-Greek understanding, with Toynbee's inaugural lecturer attended by Greek Prime Minister Venizelos. In 1921, Toynbee travelled to Asia Minor to report on the Greco-Turkish War for the Manchester Guardian. Initially a committed Philhellene, he became increasingly critical of the mistreatment of Turkish civilians and consequently increasingly unsympathetic to Greece. This reversal of sympathies made Toynbee's position as Corias chair untenable. He resigned in 1924 to become Director of Studies at Chatham House, London's main foreign policy think tank. Toynbee's 1932 article expressed sympathy for Enosis, the union of Greece and Cyprus, on the basis of what Storrs called, quote, the assumption of the Greekness of Cyprus and what seems to be a tendentious and almost propagandistic overstressing of its relative importance. Toynbee argued that Cyprus had been quote, within the Greek lands for 3,000 years. Storrs replied on 9 March 1931, attaching 2 memorandum on Cypriot ancient history written by his colonial secretary, Herbert Henneker-Heaton. Henneker-Heaton argued that, quote, 4/5 of the population were not Greeks by nationality. They may be said to be Greeks by tradition and language, but racially, historically, and geographically, the connection is indisputably remote. Expanding on his theme, Henneker-Heaton then argued, Greek has not been the predominant language of Cyprus since the latter part of the 2nd millennium BC. Indeed, until 300 BC, inscriptions in Greek were only employed for notices to visitors to the island. Greek-speaking world is too partial a definition, even if it is accurate. What is meant is the world that came under the influence of commerce and civilization made possible by Alexander the Great. If the non-Greek population is the residue of the Turkish garrison, then the Greek population is the residue of all the other numerous garrisons which had occupied Cyprus, none of them Greek, mixed with Greek, Semitic, and other colonists. Henneke Heaton's grasp of Cypriot history was tenuous. He conflated the Greek alphabet, which was indeed only commonly used in Cyprus in the 4th century, with the Greek language, which was present far earlier. Prior to the 4th century, Cypriots wrote Greek in the Cypriot syllabary, and by 1931, several Cypro-syllabic Greek inscriptions had been securely dated to the Cypro-geometric period. The Colonial Office in London attempted to adopt a similar line of argument, drawing on an April 1924 memorandum titled The Future of Cyprus by the classicist and diplomat Sir James Headlam Morley. Headlam Morley's memorandum dismissed arguments for enosis on the grounds that Cyprus had never been ruled from Greece in antiquity and lay far outside the Aegean. In a 1 April 1932 letter to Toynbee, Storrs contended, the British authorities have never, to my knowledge, entered into the historical arena on this question by denying the Greek affinities of the majority of the population. End quote. The British authorities did not dispute most Cypriots were Greek by affinity, but they suggested they were not by ethnicity, history, or geography. This appears to have been Whitehall's preferred interpretation. On 17 January 1919, Secretary of State for the Colonies, Viscount Milner, wrote that although there is, quote, a decided majority of Greeks, or at any rate Greek-speaking people in Cyprus, I very much doubt their being of the pure Greek race, end quote. This position was a Cyprus-specific version of the broader anti-Philian motif. In 1830, Austrian historian Jacob Philipp Fallermeyer had controversially argued that the inhabitants of the newly formed Greek state were not descendants of ancient Greeks, but merely successive waves of non-Greek invaders. And Thomas Kiley's demonstrated in his articles on Cyprus in the UK that the colonial and Indian exhibition similarly showed Cyprus in an exoticist rather than as part of Europe. On 23 March, E.R. Darnley, head of the Pacific and Mediterranean Department at the Colonial Office, attempted to put the Colonial Office's argument to Toynbee. Darnley reported forlornly of this conversation that, quote, my authorities quite failed to convince Professor Toynbee, and indeed he convinced me, at least to the extent that his views regarding the racial and historical aspects of the question are reasonable. In regard to the argument that Cyprus was never governed from Athens, Professor Toynbee pointed out that in ancient times, Sparta had never been governed from Athens either, end quote. Toynbee followed up by dispatching a 5-page historical note on the Greekness of ancient Cyprus to Nicosia and the Colonial Office, arguing that Cyprus had been largely Greek since the 13th century BC. Storrs replied, noting that he, quote, yielded unreservedly to your authoritative note. Interestingly, Darnley did consider invoking Einar Gerstad's work to counter Toynbee's argument, as suggested by Given. On 24 August 1931, Darnley wrote on a minute paper that when I was in Stockholm, I saw Professor Gerstad and his remarkable collection. He told me definitely that he considered the principal element of the population of Cyprus originated in Anatolia, the second was of Greek origin, and the third in importance of Syro-Phoenician. Professor Toynbee's views with regard to the Greek character of Cyprus are not borne out by the researches of Professor Gerstad. However, Darnley's suggestion came to nothing, and the Colonial Office did not seek to argue any further with Professor Toynbee. This 1932 correspondence with Toynbee suggests that the administration in Nicosia were rather ill-informed about Cypriot history, and the Colonial Office in London struggled to do more than repeat adages from previous reports. It's difficult to imagine this group of individuals colluding to fabricate an archaeological group. Nevertheless, in discussing Cypriot ancient history at such painstaking length, Toynbee and his interlocutors recognized Cypriot ancient history's deep political resonance in early 20th century Cyprus. Competing political agendas and their influence on archaeological interpretation are deeply intriguing and perhaps underexplored. Further research would be rewarding, potentially especially in Greek and Turkish language sources. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Rafi. That was extremely interesting.